less than 100 miles apart in log cabins. Both were joyous and pranksters as young men. Davis was almost expelled more than West Point more than once for drinking, for fighting, for disobedience. Abraham Lincoln had a very mirthful nature as a young man. Both were wrestlers. Abraham Lincoln had those famous matches with the Clary's Grove boys. And as a boy, Jefferson Davis was taught by slaves how to wrestle. And so he would wrestle with them and improve his physical prowess. It's interesting that both men were strong as young men, because if you look at them, they look so similar, don't they? That cadaverous look, those protruding cheekbones, the tall, cadaverous look. Lincoln was the taller man, but Davis appeared taller than he was because of that Iraq military bearing he had learned at West Point and kept for the rest of his life. They weren't heavy eaters. They weren't interested in luxury. They weren't interested in food. They weren't interested in exotic travel, in antiques, in fine furnishings, in beautiful clothing. They were very much men of the mind. They were both great readers. They loved books. Davis was wealthier and he had more books, but Lincoln read deeply and developed great reasoning and intellectual skills. And they had those things in common. They both had a peculiar kind of charisma. If you met Abraham Lincoln or Jefferson Davis, you would never forget them. Lincoln felt he was an ugly man, and he often made jokes about it. But Lincoln also knew there was something about him that was different. Certainly Lincoln knew he was smarter than a lot of people. He knew he had more talents than many. But he knew that his physical appearance was quite memorable. And Davis was the same. Both had great and effective speaking voices for entirely different reasons. Lincoln had that high, keening Kentucky accent that could travel great distances. Davis had that classic, smooth, melodious Southern accent. Davis was a mesmerizing speaker in the U.S. Senate. They had something else in common in their youth, too. Of course, their service in the Black Hawk War. Lincoln is an elected captain of militia, where his close combat consisted of something he described when he was a congressman. When he said, "Yes, I've done many bloody battles with the mosquitoes." And Jefferson Davis was an officer in the regular army, and he was given the honor of watching over the captive Chief Black Hawk. And Black Hawk was shackled and caged like a slave. And when whites came to rebuke and mock Black Hawk in his captivity, Davis rebuked them and ordered them away. Davis felt it was beneath the dignity of the captured enemy to be abused by these mocking fools. And Black Hawk complimented Davis for his sense of honor and called him a great war captain. Here is something very profound that Lincoln and Davis had in common, and I think it affected their lives and the way they thought about life for the rest of their lives. In Lincoln's case, it was Anne Rutledge. And correct me if I'm wrong, but has not my friend Michael Burlingame spoken here?
Yes, correct.
And I'm sure you've heard Michael's point of view, which I believe is absolutely correct. Burlingame is certainly the greatest Lincoln scholar alive today, and probably the best one who has ever lived or who will ever live. And this is his take on Anne Rutledge, and I agree. There was a special connection between Lincoln and Anne Rutledge. The townspeople knew it. They saw it. They witnessed what were at the time the familiar signs of courtship, walks, conversations. Anne was illiterate, poor. We have no photographs of her. Photography was in its infancy in Europe in the early 1830s, and certainly it had not come to Western Illinois. And who would have thought to paint a portrait or even draw a sketch of some poor illiterate girl on the Western frontier? One very moving document exists that links them. It's a beat-up copy of a grammar book at the Library of Congress. And Lincoln has written on the title page of that book, Anne Rutledge is now learning grammar. He was teaching her to read. She became ill suddenly and died. And Lincoln's friends at the time feared that he might commit suicide. They feared that he might go insane. That's how worried they were after his response to the death of Anne Rutledge. I think it changed Lincoln, who already had these tendencies, into a more morbid, serious, somber man who reflected for the rest of his life on the brevity of life, the meaning of life, the meaning of death, and it changed his personality. Of course, when Lincoln came to Washington, he never mentioned her name again, as far as we can tell. I think anyone in official Washington would have had no idea who Anne Rutledge in Illinois was. Mary Lincoln remembered who she was. But that's a later story. Lincoln was devastated. In the case of Jefferson Davis, her name was Sarah Knox Taylor. She went by the nickname of Knox. She was the beautiful daughter of General Zachary Taylor, who later became Davis's superior in the Mexican War. Jeff and Knox fell in love, and the Taylors were not happy. Not so much because they didn't like Jefferson Davis, but because they did not want their daughter to suffer the deprivations of an Army officer's life on the western frontier. So for 2 years, Jeff and Knox did not see each other. They kept up an active correspondence. More on the fate of those letters later. Then they met again, and Davis resigned his commission in the U.S. Army so that he could marry her. They did. Davis took her home to Mississippi, then on to his sister's plantation. There, they both became ill from a particular virulent form of malaria that had been brought to America by slaves more than 2 centuries earlier. Both almost died. Davis came out of his delirium. Jeff came out of his delirium. Excuse me. And he heard Knox singing her favorite song to him from her bed. He essentially crawled to her bedside, held her in her arms, and she died. They'd been married for 12 weeks, and she was 21 years old. Davis then went into what he called, quote, my great seclusion, close quote, where for several years he lived on his plantation in isolation. His older brother, his sponsor, had a plantation next door. So Davis spent the next several years essentially with his slaves, with his brother, with his books, and with his overseer, an unusual situation where he hired a black man to run all of his affairs. Almost unique among the planters of the South, where he had this lifelong friend who ran the plantation for him. He later emerged from that seclusion to walk in the world again, and he met Verena Howell, a wonderful teenager from a fine Mississippi family. The day they met, she didn't like him. She wrote to her mother that night or the next day, I've met Mr. Davis. He speaks in a manner which suggests he thinks he's always right. And mother, I think he's your age. But then Verena wrote, and yet, there's something about him. And this is one way that Lincoln and Davis diverged, I think, in a major way. Jefferson Davis married well and was fortunate to find a second-grade woman after his first love died. Abraham Lincoln was fated to marry Mary Todd. And I believe that Abraham Lincoln became a great man and leader in spite of Mary Todd Lincoln. And Jefferson Davis, before the Civil War, became a great leader and politician very much with the help of Verena Davis and because of Verena Davis. Interesting thing about the qualifications of each man, and here's an interesting question to ask yourself. I'm not about to send an email. I just want to make sure I don't talk too long, so I need to lay this down in front of me. So, imagine if you're voting for president, or if you're asked as late as 1858. Forget whether you're a Whig or a Democrat or one of the members of the new Republican Party. Forget about who you want to be president. Just think of who you predict could be president. If you ask most Americans as late as early 1858, who was the future president of the United States? Jefferson Davis of Mississippi or Abraham Lincoln of Illinois? most people, a majority I'm convinced, would have said Jefferson Davis, of course. And a good percentage would have said Abraham who? Davis first. A graduate of the college, then a graduate of the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. A hero of the Mexican War. Wounded in battle, refused to leave the field, and led his troops forward in victory on two valiant occasions. Became a congressman, U.S. senator, one of our best secretaries of war in our history. Became a leader in the Senate, a spokesman for a whole region of the nation. Widely educated, widely read, who loved the North, who traveled widely in the North, who gave speeches in the North, who even vacationed in the North. A man who said, together with your great industry and our great agriculture, we shall conquer this continent. A man who went on long treks across the country, really cross-continental journeys. Some of them almost Lewis and Clark-like level in terms of a 1,000-mile journey on horses across the parched deserts, or journeys through snow and ice across rivers. He learned the greatness of the expanse of the American continent. A man who thought secession was a very bad idea, who said secession will hurt the South and possibly destroy the South. A man who did not campaign to be president of the Confederacy, and who did not want to be president of the Confederacy, and accepted the appointment of acclamation under protest. Look at the other candidate. A graduate of the first grade, who never learned really proper social behavior. A one-term unsuccessful U.S. congressman, which led him to oppose one of our most effective presidents. Yes, James K. Polk, one of the most effective presidents in our history regarding the Mexican War. Lincoln challenged him on where the spot of hostilities began, and of course that created back home in Illinois the nickname Spotty Lincoln. Essentially, Lincoln was accusing the president of deceitfully fomenting the Mexican War by claiming that U.S. forces had set foot on Mexican territory and precipitated the hostilities. Lincoln leaves Congress and becomes a lawyer. But he doesn't become a lawyer like Daniel Webster or William Wirt, or a great advocate before the Supreme Court or federal courts advocating great constitutional principles. Abraham Lincoln becomes a collections lawyer. Yes, it is true. Almost 50% of Abraham Lincoln's law practice consisted of petty collection matters. The law practice later became a source of Lincoln's genius. Those more than 20 years as a lawyer really were an amateur course in psychology or psychiatry. Thousands of clients, thousands of cases, thousands of legal briefs, and witnessing the cases of other lawyers and friends. Lincoln really became an expert in human aspirations, human weaknesses, human excellence, human depravity. Murders, libels, theft, battery, arson. You name something people could do, and Lincoln was either involved in a case relating to it, or he witnessed the oral arguments for such a case. Nonetheless, he never administered anything bigger than his two-man law office. It's really true. He put the documents in his hat. It's really true. He had a folder that said, if you can't find it anywhere else, look here. It's really true, and I've seen it myself. A note he wrote as president to one of his male secretaries. A few days ago, I'm certain I had the papers of such and such case on my table. I can't find them anywhere. Does anyone know where they are? That's the kind of administrator he was. And so, certainly on paper, the 16th President of the United States, on paper, was one of the least qualified men ever elected to the office. Any attempt to compare Abraham Lincoln to the first 5 presidents of the United States would have been considered an absurd joke in terms of comparing him to their intelligence, their ability, their service to the nation. People would have thought it ridiculous to compare a man like Abraham Lincoln to Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, and many of the others. In fact, it's even possible that if the Democrats had gotten their act together in the election of 1860, if the the Democratic Party had not split, and if John C. Breckinridge and Stephen A. Douglas, and later John Bell with the Union Party, if there were not three candidates running against Abraham Lincoln, and if somehow the South had nominated Jefferson Davis as the sole candidate to run against Abraham Lincoln, Davis might possibly have actually won the presidential election of 1860. They never met, never knew each other, never laid eyes on each other, even though there was a period total of several months where they were in Washington at the same time. Lincoln simply didn't move in the circles that Davis might have moved in. Lincoln had no important Southern friends at all. He did become friends with Alexander Stephens, the future vice president of the Confederacy. Lincoln never traveled the South. He never traveled the nation. He never saw the breadth of the continent firsthand. And he did not have Jefferson Davis's appreciation of the South, of the way Davis had appreciation of the North. So here they are. There was at least one great fundamental difference between them. Then I'll get to the ultimate similarity. That difference, which prevented compromise, I think there was no way they could have compromised, was this question: who is man? What is man? What is the nature of man? What is freedom? Abraham Lincoln once said, if slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong. Lincoln says, as I would not be a slave, I would not be a master. Now, we know the full truth about Abraham Lincoln's view on race and emancipation. We know that Abraham Lincoln was never an abolitionist. Many of the abolitionists hated him for being so tardy coming to the subject of emancipation. We know that Abraham Lincoln never believed in equality of result or equality in an abstract concept. We know that Abraham Lincoln believed in absolute equality under the law and the absolute right and equality of anyone to be free, to earn their own living, to not be enslaved, not have their property stolen from them, or their own bodies stolen from them. Jefferson Davis believed the opposite. From infancy, he grew up into the slave system. Davis not only thought slavery was slavery was lawful, he thought it was good. He, like most of the elite planners, thought that slavery had civilized the heathen people from Africa and Christianized them, and they actually believed, and you can see this in ministers from the sermons of ministers, the argument that slavery was a positive good, not just something tolerable, but good. And on that, Lincoln and Jefferson Davis could not possibly have ever agreed on such a fundamental issue. Ultimately, they believed the following. And what I'm about to say, I don't mean as a criticism of Lincoln or a criticism of Davis. I simply mean it as a factual statement. Abraham Lincoln and Jefferson Davis are the two greatest killers in American history. Both were willing to kill hundreds of thousands of their fellow Americans in order to vindicate the principles of what they believed was right. Lincoln comes down to us as a man of flexibility, as a man of compromise, a man of negotiation. That is often true. But once Abraham Lincoln absolutely decided on a position, he would never change his mind. He once said, similar in a letter, the Emancipation Proclamation has been issued. I'm paraphrasing now. I shall not retract or modify it. Like broken eggs, the past cannot be mended. The Emancipation Proclamation stands forever. Lincoln fought the Civil War to vindicate, among others, these principles. Free elections. He believed the results of the election of 1860 had to stand. If you didn't like who was president, you couldn't just leave the game, split the Union. Lincoln also believed in the principles of democracy, and once he issued the proclamation of freedom. And to vindicate those principles, I'm absolutely convinced that Lincoln would have fought the Civil War forever if necessary. Abraham Lincoln would have endured not just the 320,000 Union men who died. Lincoln would have been willing to tolerate 1 million Union casualties to win the Civil War. He simply would never have given up. Jefferson Davis, the same. He was simply not going to surrender. Even as late as April 1865, he was entertaining schemes of possibly winning the war and creating the Confederacy in the west of the Mississippi. So, as each president laid his head on his pillow each night in his mansion less than 100 miles apart, each was pursuing his own dream. Lincoln's dream of victory and freedom, and Davis's dream of independence and freedom for the southern states. And I just find it so interesting. Many things they had in common, and many differences they had. And one final tragedy united them in the White Houses. I mentioned the death of Willie in February 1862, which absolutely devastated Abraham Lincoln. I'm convinced that he viewed that as the single worst thing that ever happened to him. And it was tough to write that section of the book. It was very moving to me to write about what Lincoln said, what he saw, what he did when Willie died. And in June 1864, one of Jefferson Davis's boys fell to his death from the balcony of the Confederate White House. Davis was at his office. He was summoned home. The boy had crushed his skull. His chest was crushed. Legs were broken. He fell in exactly the worst way possible. And he'd been brought into the house. And Jefferson Davis arrived only in time to look into the boy's eyes, squeeze his hand, and watch him die. So for the second time in 30 years, he had that experience. Mary Chestnut writes that all the elite of the Confederacy came to the Confederate White House that night to console Davis. He wouldn't come down. They could hear him pacing on the second floor, where the children's rooms were, and he would not come down. And that was his great tragedy. And I find it utterly fascinating to look at them side by side and look at their similarities, their differences, their shared tragedies. And so much of this was new to me that I really can't